very challenging doing research in immigration detention centres because the people who are locked up in them are very depressed and anxious. They're going through a very difficult time in their life where they're uncertain about what's coming next, and they're often rather shocked by finding themselves locked up in institutions that look like prisons. And so as sites of research, they're enormously complicated. You have to deal with the emotional strain that people are undergoing, as well as the sort of legal complexity of these sites and the cultural and linguistic challenges. So as foreigners who are being removed or deported, most people in detention, although they may speak some English, they're not fluent, and my own language skills are not particularly useful. And so there's all of these challenges about trying to actually make human connections with people who I want to feel at ease with me. So before I did the research in immigration detention centres, I had many years' experience of doing research in prisons, which are also quite complicated sites. I thought detention centres would be like prisons. So I went into the field with a set of expectations about how to gain trust, how to spend time in a carceral institution, the kinds of issues that I thought I would encounter. And I quickly found that most of those expectations didn't apply and actually were quite unhelpful. And that's because in a prison, people are serving a sentence. They have some understanding of why they're there. Quite often they accept the legitimacy of why they're there. They know they did a crime. And also prisons are very structured places. There's a clear regime in most of them. In detention centres, on the other hand, people are often taken unexpectedly by immigration authorities, so they weren't ready to come, so they sometimes arrive with nothing. They very rarely think they deserve to be locked up, even if they understood that their legal status was precarious. And then in Britain, there's no statutory limit on how long you can be detained unless you're pregnant or in a family group. And so people don't know how long they're going to be there for. And so one of the things that happens quite commonly in detention is people arrive and think that this is just, a misunderstanding, that they'll be able to fix their immigration problem and they'll be going home, back into the British community. And then over time, as the weeks start to pass, they realise that that's actually not what's going to happen. And so people's anxiety gets greater and greater and greater. The whole system is very unpredictable, and I think that lack of predictability, that uncertainty, is at the heart of what is so difficult for people who are detained to manage. The other aspect of their experience, which they find very difficult and becomes difficult for the researcher, is that detention is really, it allows the state to intervene into people's personal life. It's basically saying, we're detaining you to remove you from the country. All of those things you wanted to do in the UK, all of those aspirations, you can't have anymore. You're not deserving of those, and we're now going to get rid of you. The people who are going through detention, they feel it very personally. It feels very personal. And so people who are detained are often extremely emotionally volatile. They feel like they're being rejected. And so when they're confronted with a researcher who comes in and says, "Tell me what it's like to be detained," they're often, quite understandably rather reluctant to speak to the person, to speak to me, or else they're full of emotion. And so one of the things that happens is that they're angry, they cry, they're confused, they have all of these very intense emotions. And when I first entered the field, I wasn't ready for that. I didn't expect that because it hadn't really been my experience in other sites of incarceration. Experiencing other people's trauma and anxiety has had an enormous effect on me, and not one that I was expecting, and not one that I was initially particularly well equipped to manage. I found listening to people's stories of their trauma affected my sleep, seems to have affected my sleep permanently, gave me all sorts of physical experiences and also emotional responses. I tried to set in place structures to manage those feelings. One of the basic things I would do would be that I would create a space when I come back from the field before I have to do anything else, and that's normally again, I find that my response to my experiences it's physical. So one of the things I do often when I come back from the field is the first thing I do is I have a shower and I change all my clothes. So there's this kind of transition out of the field back into the domestic area. The most useful strategy I've found is really to talk about the research with colleagues, because in criminology, everybody's doing research on difficult things. And so if I start saying, this is what I was told today, or this is how I'm feeling today, then my colleagues who might be doing research on something completely different, so domestic violence or policing, they at least have an understanding of what it's like to be told these stories and to witness great tragedies. It's an ongoing challenge to manage the difficulties of this field research that I do. And I've been going into detention centres since 2009, so for 8 years now. And I don't just go into detention centres in Britain, I also visit them in other countries, so in Greece and in Hungary. Nothing's improved over the 8 years, and in many respects, certainly outside of the UK, matters have worsened. So there is an enormous challenge about trying to keep going. And the way I manage it is I try and create space between the field visits, so I don't do it all the time. I also vary the kinds of approaches that I take. So for the last few years, I have had less focus in my research on detainees and more focus on staff. I've also started doing more interdisciplinary work. So I have an art project that I'm working on with an artist. And that we work with detainees, but it's a slightly more positive way of trying to discuss the issues of border control. I think that the task for me as a researcher is to be mindful of it and to be constantly checking what my boundaries are and whether I'm still able to do effective research and to be empathetic and to be thoughtful and careful. But I think we're living in a world where difficult things are happening, and that one of our jobs as academics is to shine a light on that and to think about that critically and to engage with policy makers, because policy makers, aren't in the business of causing pain. They don't want to do that. So they also are open to discussions about how to change things. My advice for people who are preparing to do fieldwork in similar contexts would be to create a structure of people who they can talk to about the process before they go into the field, and to be conscious that they will bring their own emotions back with them into all sorts of aspects of their life that they might not be anticipating. So into their friendships, into their relationships with their children. And that other people might not be able to handle listening to what they want to say. So that really, I think it's important to have a group of other academics or other students, other people who perhaps, they may not be in the same field, but they may be field researchers or they may be interested in some aspect of it. I think you need a connection. Students in particular should look into the secondary trauma counselling that is available through the student counselling service. I think that they should be setting up regular debriefing sessions with their supervisors, and that they should be keeping very detailed field notes. I also think one of the things to anticipate is the need for time. And so in my own research, it was 12 months before I could go back and reread my field notes and transcripts. In the first project I did, it took me 12 months to be able to revisit the field notes without having a physical response to them. So one of the difficulties when you're a PhD student is you only have 3 years. So building in 12 months is unrealistic, but I think it certainly is worth considering building in a period of 1 or 2 months where you actually just don't go back to them, because you need emotional space in order to think critically. And without that emotional space, then I think what you just do is you just replicate ideas. It's very easy to feel very anxious. You can't do anything very creative.